Well, we are in the last chapter of Nehemiah, and we're going to split it up into two parts. This week is Slow Leaks. Next week we'll do Finishing Well, but it's really kind of one unit as far as Nehemiah. What I'll be telling you about will continue into next week with the issues that he's going to confront. But let me set a scene for you, because we've had a lot of celebration in the book of Nehemiah at these last three chapters. The people have repented and they've sought God out. They've made vows and promises and all these great things. And now we run into chapter 13. But the story is a mother who came home one afternoon, and she discovered her children were all huddled together in the living room floor, and she couldn't see what they were doing. And so she kind of wanted to know, what are you so intensely concentrating on? So she came up behind them. And Ellie, you might want to be careful, because you kind of live out in the country. This could be you. So she walks behind her kids to see what they're doing, and she can't believe her eyes. Because there in the middle of her little brood of kids were like 4 baby skunks. This could be you.
It could be.
Aren't they cute? Well, that's what the kids thought. So the mother urgently yells, "Children, run!" So each child grabbed a skunk and ran to his room. And that would probably also might be what could happen to you. So sometimes life doesn't turn out like you would expect. What you think is going to happen doesn't happen. And I wonder if Nehemiah had that thought as he was called back to Susa in Persia, to the capital, and left things after being governor for 12 years. So, things had left on a high note, the things that I had mentioned, but chapter 13 is less than a happy ending to the story. Nehemiah, when he returned to Persia, we don't know how long he was gone, but when he got word or he came back, things had changed. So we had all of what we've read about, then 12 years, so he's governor, so he's overseeing these things. He goes away, could have been just a few months, a few years, and the people lapse. The people go back to their old ways of doing things. They ignored the sacred vows that we read about in chapter 11 and before. The real test of revival, we said that was like a revival. They made this commitment that they celebrated the Feast of Tabernacles better than they had in, centuries, literally, for them. But the real test of revival, the real test of what God is, when God does this mighty, wonderful, great work in your heart, can you sustain it? What happens years later? Because we get in these emotional highs, and, I worked in Christian camps a lot when I was in seminary, and we would see a lot of kids rededicate their lives. And, that little campfire thing, they light a stick and throw it in the fire, and I'm going to love my sister and brother now and not beat them up anymore, and I'll do my chore, or whatever the kids would promise. And then, you'd find out that they'd make it about as long as we make it with New Year's resolutions, a couple of weeks, and then they fall back. And so the rededication the next year, it didn't last long. I came back to camp to get another shot. But how do we sustain those big mountaintop experiences where God moves in a mighty way, and then we come down into the valley of everyday life? I love how Eugene Peterson, he called it a long obedience in the same direction. That kind of captures what we're after and what Nehemiah was after. A long obedience in the same direction. Because spiritual decline, it's kind of like if you get a flat tire. Now, maybe you've been in a car and especially, if you're driving and a front tire just, pop, it blows out and the air is gone and you have to hobble over to the side. And it's big, it's dramatic, it's scary. But normally that's not how flat tires happen. Normally it's like a slow leak. The air starts, and you don't even notice it if you don't check your tires like me, you just sort of look, oh, look, that, or you notice in your steering, if it's a front tire, all of a sudden it's getting harder to steer. And so even on your bike, sometimes you don't notice until it's getting harder to pedal. And slow leaks is much more common than the big dramatic, big blowout. But the spiritual life is often like that. We're unaware that we're starting to drift, that we're starting to lose our passion. It kind of slowly creeps in, and we start noticing we're not as excited about things as having our time with God that we once were. And so I want to challenge you to look inside your own spiritual life and see, are there any slow leaks? Are there some things where you see your heart isn't quite as on fire, or you're not following through on some things that you promised God you wanted to follow through on? So look and evaluate your heart today for slow leaks. So Nehemiah chapter 13, we'll begin with verse 4. So before this, Eliashib, the priest, had been in charge of the storerooms of the house of our God. So that's the temple. He was closely associated, Eliashib, with Tobiah, and he had provided him with a large room formerly used to store the grain offerings and incense and temple articles, and also the tithes of grain, new wine, and olive oil prescribed for the Levites, musicians, and gatekeepers, as well as the contributions for the priests. But while all this was going on, I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, that's just a province of Persia at this point, I had returned to the king. Okay, so after serving as governor for that 12 years, and he comes back, the text doesn't tell us how long, and he sees spiritual compromise in the people, in their spiritual leadership. Now, Ezra, who was during this time overlapped Nehemiah, evidently Ezra wasn't there either because they lapsed. They slid into this thing. The leaders in particular, of whom Eliashib would be as the chief priest, would be important. So with Nehemiah away, Eliashib not only allowed the Ammonite Tobiah. Now, how many remember Tobiah? No one remembers. Richard remembers Tobiah, and that's it. Okay, back in chapters 3, I think we get to meet him for the first time. Actually, 2 and 6. And, Tobiah and Sanballat, we will name, and Geshem, the Arab, these guys got together to oppose the building of the wall. They threatened the people. They sent letters to Artaxerxes saying Nehemiah is trying to take over and lead a rebellion. And they did everything they could to stop the building of the wall. So you have this guy who's been very important in opposing you and a major arch enemy. And so now we're providing him a room in the temple. What is up with that? Why in the world would Eliashib think that was a good idea? So Eliashib was supposed to he's supposed to kind of keep him out of the city, but he puts him in the temple, where all of the important worship things that were named in that passage, the grains and the oils, and all of those things were stored there as a part of their worship of offerings and celebrations and incense and things. And so instead of keeping him out of the city, he put him in the very nerve center of the community, right there in the temple. So the priest responsible to protect the sanctity of the temple has compromised. Compromise is probably too mild of a word for what was going on there. Eliashib had just totally dropped the ball. He was abusing his office. So remember this mocker guy, he's now in this nerve center, and he can have a lot of influence. He can begin to, he's got the religious people right there around him. He can go out into the city, and he can spin his webs of influence. Now, maybe Tobiah Eliashib was reasoning. Tobiah has a Jewish name. It's from the Hebrew word tob, which means good. So, he's got a name that in Hebrew and Aramaic is good. Maybe, he's not such a bad guy after all because his name has that in there. He's not totally Ammonite. In fact, we even have the fact he's a real person. So those are Hebrew letters for Tobiah. Or maybe Aramaic letters for Tobiah, since the script is probably the same. And so we know he was a real person. This isn't just some story that got made up. So how would this happen, though? How does Eliashib, in charge of the spiritual welfare and the political welfare, because those two were linked together, end up letting the enemy in? Well, maybe because Nehemiah is gone, Nehemiah took his Persian armies with him. He felt like, well, I don't have the protection Nehemiah had, so I'm going to have to kind of work some political deals. I'm going to have to go horse trade and try to make these enemies happy so they won't harm me. And so we also find, though, that Eliashib and Tobiah were both politically connected, very closely politically connected. Tobiah, his son or grandson, married Sanballat. Remember I mentioned that name as one of the opposers. Married one of the members of Sanballat's family. And since Sanballat and Tobiah are linked together, now Eliashib is joining this lovely little circle of political cronies who are kind of trying to run the province. And so maybe it's because, blood is thicker than water. And in the Middle East, that kind of thing is so strong, those ties of family. You just don't betray your family, or if you have to stick with them, even if we certainly heard stories of families betraying one another, but only within the family, not going outside the family. So maybe Eliashib, the high priest, is thinking, or the priest, that, these are my family members. I have to. This is Middle East custom. This is how we work. This is the way things are. So my grandson's married into this family of Sanballat, who is the governor of Samaria, the area to the north. And so even though this was defiling his priesthood, his son's marriage, even that relationship with all of these people who were not Israelites, defiled Eliashib's relationships. The biggest thing was he allowed the fox in the hen house, so to speak. He allowed this evil experience and this evil influence to come into the temple. Maybe, though, Eliashib was just being pragmatic. Maybe he was just being politically pragmatic. You can't just insist on your principles and push them forward when there's opposition. You got to make deals, right? Isn't that how we often see work? We've watched this Danish program called Borgen, which means parliament in Danish. And it's, as much as you get frustrated with our two-party system, you look at which is how Britain does it, this coalition governments in there, and it's even worse. It's just a bunch of people trying to I'll give you this if you give me that. You support me in this so I can, and then you end up with nothing. And so maybe, and I'm not sticking up for Eliashib, but maybe he decided he was going to be a politician, not a priest, at least in his actions. And so he gave everything away that he shouldn't have given away because he didn't trust God. Slow leaks. That, wow, the army's gone, I'm feeling vulnerable, Nehemiah's not there to boss me around anymore, so I'm going to work my deals with my family. And so maybe these are not just slow leaks, but whole blowouts. But it gave an opening to the enemy, the openings God had warned against. So now let's work our way through more of Nehemiah 13, verse 6. The other half, sometime later, I ask his permission, and his being Artaxerxes, the emperor, so to speak, and came back to Jerusalem. Here I learned about the evil thing Eliashib had done in providing Tobiah a room in the courts of the house of God. I was greatly displeased and threw all Tobiah's household goods out of the room. I gave orders to purify the rooms, and then I put back into them the equipment of the house of God with the grain offerings and the incense. Now, Nehemiah is not a shrinking violet. This guy's a strong leader. I was listening to a podcast going, we hold Nehemiah up as our leadership example, and in many ways he is. But, he was known for pulling people by the hair and doing can you just imagine this picture? He sees this. He's outraged. He goes into the temple. He just gets all of Tobiah's stuff and just throws it out into the streets. I can just kind of imagine as he's kind of ranting and raving and yelling at them and throwing this stuff out. But he was zealous to cleanse that holy space. That was, he said, oh my gosh, look, the biggest danger right now is you guys have put this guy into the temple and you are risking God's displeasure. As much as you might, Eliashib, be afraid of the politics or the family blood stuff that you won't, have a table at Thanksgiving dinner, a seat at the table, fearing God is a much bigger thing. So he had to purify. He throws this stuff out so he can bring the other stuff back in, and it will have to be purified so that they can worship God. Nehemiah took it seriously. Purity of worship was important. It had to be protected. Because this community that Nehemiah is trying to serve and help, look how quick. It's only a few years and they've already slid. And as we'll see, they've also stopped supporting the Levites and the other temple workers. So Nehemiah had to do something because there was spiritual danger that God could come at any point and just say, okay, we'll start all over. Back to exile you go. So number one on your outline, number one, slow leak, ignoring your vow to keep God as Lord. And I'm sure from Eliashib's point of view, he had all these pressures and he could justify that. Maybe we have all these kinds of pressures, so we can justify things that we do, little compromises. Well, I have to do this in my business. Well, I'm so busy, I don't have time to really be with Jesus. I can't serve. I remember a person in a big Bible church I was serving in Virginia who said, I can't help any of the ministries of the church because I've got one more year to do precepts, which is like Bible study fellowship. And it's so much study, I can't serve, I can't do anything. Another guy who was actually one of our elders and said, and I don't keep track of tithes and don't know who gives what. I've never wanted to know. And he says, well, we're buying a great big house down in Woodbridge, and so we're not going to be able to tithe like we once give. We're going to have to catch up for a few years. Okay, now I'm not here. I know you sound like, wow, you're judgmental, and maybe I am, but it's not mine. All I know is that I just remember in my gut just feeling like, wow, you're going to, you're drifting. Your priorities have just shifted away. But that's between you and God. It wasn't mine to tell him, nope, you shouldn't do that. But those things are easy to justify in our mind. Ignoring your vow to keep God as Lord. After years of street violence and drug use and thievery, Fernando was sent to prison to serve a 25-year to life sentence. In prison, Fernando's life was just as violent as when he was on the outside. Well, one day, Fernando's 70-year-old mother came to visit him in prison, and she started crying and said, I don't want to die seeing you like this, for this to be my last image of you in prison, and then I'll die and never see you again. Fernando made a simple prayer to God that day. God, if you will get me out of this hellhole, I promise to serve you for the rest of my life. Well, a year later, this 25-year to life sentence, he got paroled after a year, strangely. And so Fernando's out on the streets and things are not any better than they were before prison. He's still doing drugs and all that. But because he's on parole, he's on a 3-day drug binge and he sees the police coming his way. And he knows if they know who he is and they catch him, and that he will be sent back because he can't have drugs in his system. So Fernando sees this great big mob of people in a park across the street. And so he runs across the street and disappears into the mob. The mob was Victory Outreach Ministries, who were having a rally in the park. It was a street rally. And this big tall man with a long mustache and big muscles, maybe a friend of Ibar's, came up to him and he grabbed him and he says to him, let me read the quote to get it right. "Hey bro, don't you remember the day you prayed in your prison cell that if God would release you from that hellhole, you would serve him the rest of your life?" Now, Fernando's going, how in the world does this complete stranger know I prayed this private prayer in a prison cell, not out on the street? How does he know what I prayed? The exact words. And so the guy said, you know what you need to do. And he fell down on his knees into the grass. And he prayed and he repented. And so Fernando, stunned as he was, as he prayed and wept, "God, forgive me all my sins." So the power of God brought a criminal to full surrender. And so he moved into a discipleship house that Victory Outreach Ministries had for people that they could come in and be discipled and change their life. Because it's not enough, as Bruce can tell you, you can just get people off of drugs and alcohol, but that doesn't change their heart, does it? Because they got there for a reason, and you got to get down to the core, to the root issue of the problem. And so Fernando's mother would come to see him, and the prison shackles would not be her final image of him after all. She saw Fernando free in more ways than one. Now, often evil works quietly, invading before we realize we've compromised ourselves. And sometimes we do this thing where we think, I got to get rid of this thing, but I'm going to do it in stages. So we make a truce and we say, well, I won't do the big things, God. I'll just have some milder versions of it. But we're compromising. We're letting the slow leak. We're going to keep the blowout from happening by not doing the big sin or the big problem. But now I'm just going to do the little things, because I want to compromise it. I can't let it go. So this lesser, lukewarm version becomes a slow leak in our life that will drain our spiritual air just as readily down the road. So what Tobiahs are influencing you? What is out there that's kind of, you feel like you can't take them on directly, so you're dancing around them at work, at school, in your family, maybe interpersonal issue you have or something you're struggling with in the privacy of your own heart. What are the Tobiahs trying to tempt you to compromise and put slow leaks, to give corruption a toehold that's going to take over your life? How could you seek God and His Spirit instead, just to say, I need to come to you with this, like Fernando did, and realize God sees it all. You go, well, okay, I don't have a big mustached guy telling me what's going on in my prayer life, but God hears it. God's aware of it just as much as a human. That was obviously some kind of a prophetic, outpouring that God gave this guy. But maybe you don't get that, but doesn't mean God doesn't hear it and isn't aware of it. So, seek God's Spirit and find true life. So that's point number one, ignoring your vow to keep God as Lord. And there are actually going to be about 4 or 5 areas between today and next week, so we'll do 2 of them. So there will be more. But Nehemiah 13, verse 10, I also learned that the portions assigned to the Levites had not been given to them. And all the Levites and musicians responsible for the service of the temple had gone back to their own fields. Now, go back to what we just read. So they've taken all of the grain and the oil and all of this stuff. There's no more tithes in the temple And so the Levites lived on these things. This is how they survived. The priests, the Levites, so they had no choice but to go back to the fields that they were given in the inheritance of the land. They got certain fields and cities, and that's their only way to survive. So they leave the temple. So not only is the stuff not in the temple, and Tobiah is in the temple people, the staff, if you will, the pastors and the deacons and the elders are all gone because they have to go make a living. And so there's nothing going on in the temple. They went and were forced to go home. So why have the people, though, stopped giving their offerings? Well, it doesn't say for sure. Maybe the priests had stopped teaching about how giving is very vital to your spiritual life. It's like a litmus test of where you are. Maybe the people knew all this was going on. I kind of suspect that was certainly true also, at least. And said, why in the world would we give to a temple where there's a bunch of Gentiles roaming around, and Eliashib, our priest, has compromised and allowed these awful defilements to occur in our temple? I'm not going to support that. And so the people quit giving. And again, they can say to God, you couldn't expect me to support that, would you? Maybe they were just disgusted with Eliashib's compromise and laxness in his duties. So they quit giving. Whatever the reason, the people were still failing because God didn't say, give if you like the church. Give if you agree with the pastor. Give if the programs they do fit what you think is great. And if they change and you don't like the new person who comes in or their program stops, then you stop giving because, you're going to express your displeasure that way. And I've heard that in my last interim in the Evangelical Free Church. They changed their doctrinal statement as a whole denominations to take out the word premillennial return of Jesus to be glorious return. And so the church, we're going to quit supporting the national office. We won't give them any more money. And that's what one of the two elders that were there, that was his solution to show his displeasure. So I don't know. Again, I'm not saying was he absolutely wrong. I don't know. It's between him and God. But I know that God doesn't say that you put strings and attach them to your gifts. That it's God's money anyway. So how does he want you to direct it? So Malachi, who was the prophet around this time, chapter 3, verse 9 and 10, reproved the Jews for these same sins. Malachi 3, you are under a curse, your whole nation, because you are robbing me. And I think God was talking to this people at this time. Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, then that there may be food in my house. Test me in this, says the Lord Almighty, and see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that there will not be enough room to store it. So, obviously Malachi, and when Nehemiah has come back, has said, no, you have to still support the temple because it's the lifeblood of the community. This is the center of how we relate to God. You can't just decide to do it if you feel like it or if you like something or don't like something. Then let's fix the situation that you're not happy about. But you still have to say, let me give to you, God. So does that make sense to you for your life? Do you believe that principle that Malachi gave, that you have to keep giving to God? That it has to become the centerpiece of your life because it's a form of worship, not a way to vote for something you like or don't like. Nehemiah goes on in verse 11. So I rebuked the officials. Why is the house of God neglected? Then I called them together and stationed them at their posts. All Judah brought the tithes of grain, new wine, and olive oil into the storerooms. I put Shelemiah the priest, Zadok the scribe, and a Levite in charge of the storerooms because they were considered trustworthy. They were made responsible for distributing the supplies to their fellow Levites. And then Nehemiah will say this next week a couple of times at least. Remember me for this, my God, and do not blot out what I have so faithfully done for the house of my God and its services. So Nehemiah sees a definite calling there. And he wants to make sure that God is honored. He returns to rouse the people to remember your vow you said you would give and support the Lord's work. And so the people renew their commitment to put God first in their finances, to give God what's rightfully his. And so when all of this gets cleaned up and you get the temple cleaned out and then you put the right stuff in the temple, they're able to worship God and renew their vow. Because it isn't just about God wanting to collect their money. God wants to just be a community where they trust him, they honor him, they look to him in their everyday life. And Nehemiah brought back temple officers to restore worship. He appointed the 3 men from these diverse places, the priests, the Levites, and the scribe, because he wanted to make sure that everybody got represented as much as he could, and he wanted people of character that he could trust, that weren't going to steal, that weren't going to say, oh, here, you come and I'll give you this benefit and this thing. If you'll help me, then I'll help you. Once again, godly leadership was absolutely crucial for Israel's spiritual future. So leak number 2, ignoring your vow to give to God's work. Ignoring your vow to give to God's work. They ignored their vow to put him at the center, at Lord, and to give to God's work. And then next week we'll find they're also have broken their vows in their marriages. They're still intermarrying where they shouldn't have. And so Nehemiah is going to confront some more of those things also. Slow leaks come when we ignore our commitment to God first. So, last story for you. Imagine an 8-year-old boy, and he's playing with this little toy truck. And you know how boys are. He breaks the truck. I know, kind of hard to imagine, huh? No, not at all. But this is a firm wooden truck there. He broke it anyway, and he's sad, and he cries to his parents. And what did he ask? Fix it. Come on, Daddy, fix my truck. Fix it. And he's crying. And then the dad shares this great news with him. He goes, but wait, you have a rich uncle who just died, and he left you $10 million. Now, what is the boy going to do with that wonderful news? Absolutely. You can tell the parents of boys. He didn't care. 10 million is out there. It's meaningless. He doesn't even know how much that is. Fix my truck. He does not know his rich condition. He's now a rich little boy. And do we not do the same in our spiritual life? We get so focused on what's going on right now in our life, our problem, or how are we going to solve this, or look at how horrible our nation's doing, or our state is doing, and we forget to say, God, I live in your riches. How can the joy of God, if I go about in my community where people are struggling, can I bring the light and the joy? We need that long obedience in the same direction. That we believe he is sufficient, and so we can trust him no matter what. So as you think about the commitment that you've made to God, do you have some slow leaks that if you were to go patch those up, do you trust that God will come and meet with you in your point of need and recommitment? Are you ready to plug those slow leaks and run the race God has laid out for you? Let's pray.